Haifa is burning tonight. The port city that represents Israel's primary naval installation, its most important industrial harbor, and the northern gateway through which the majority of Israeli maritime trade flows has fallen to 45,000 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps ground forces who crossed the Lebanese border in the early hours of this morning and reached the port perimeter in a ground assault of a speed and a tactical coherence that the IDF's degraded northern command infrastructure was completely unable to contest. The Israeli Navy base at Haifa, the installation housing Israel's submarine fleet, its surface combatant force, and the naval command architecture through which Israel has projected maritime power in the eastern Mediterranean for 70 years, has been destroyed. Not captured intact, destroyed. IRGC forces who reached the base perimeter before the Israeli Navy's evacuation protocols could be completed found a base that had been partly demolished by retreating Israeli personnel and finished the demolition with the weapons they carried. I want you to understand what the fall of Haifa means before I walk you through how it happened. Haifa is not simply a military installation. It is the physical anchor of Israeli naval power and the primary port through which American military resupply to Israeli forces has been flowing throughout this conflict. The submarines that constituted Israel's nuclear second strike capability were based at Haifa. The surface combatants that have been the Israeli Navy's primary operational platforms were based at Haifa. The Naval Command infrastructure connecting Israeli maritime forces to the National Command Authority was headquartered at Haifa. All of it is either gone or in IRGC hands tonight. The United States has ordered an immediate retreat of its remaining military and advisory personnel from the northern Israeli theater. I am using the word retreat with the precision that 31 years inside the American national security establishment gives me the standing to apply to it. Not redeployment. Not precautionary repositioning. Retreat. American forces are moving south and away from the IRGC ground advance as quickly as the available transport assets can move them. The retreat order was transmitted from U.S. Central Command within 2 hours of the IRGC's first penetration of the Haifa Port perimeter. 2 hours. That is how long it took Washington to assess the ground situation and conclude that American military presence in the northern theater serves no purpose that the available assets can accomplish. Stay with me. Before I walk you through the operational anatomy of what I am reconstructing from today's engagement, let me lay out the 4 questions that define everything we need to understand. The first is how 45,000 IRGC ground forces moved from the Lebanese border to the Haifa port perimeter in a time frame that the IDF's Northern Command infrastructure was unable to contest, and what the operational architecture of that advance tells me about the depth of IRGC ground warfare planning and the specific degradation of Israeli defensive capability that made it possible. The second is what the destruction of the Haifa naval base means for Israeli military capacity specifically, and for the broader collapse of Israeli conventional defense capability that the accumulated losses of this conflict have produced. The third is what drove the American retreat order, and what the specific timing of that order, transmitted within 2 hours of IRGC forces reaching the Haifa port perimeter, tells me about the state of American strategic assessment of the Israeli military situation. And the fourth is what the fall of Haifa means for the global strategic order, for the petrodollar, and for the accelerating consolidation of the post-American Middle Eastern order that tonight's events have pushed past another threshold of irreversibility. Every answer is coming. Let me get into it. If you have been following U.S. Watch Truth because you want honest analysis that engages directly with operational evidence rather than the managed narrative that official voices provide, I need you to act on that right now. Subscribe to this channel immediately. Hit like, share this video with everyone in your network who needs to understand what the fall of Haifa means before the institutional framing takes over. And leave your assessment in the comments, because I need your thinking on the ground warfare implications of tonight's IRGC advance, as much as you need my operational reconstruction. This community makes the analysis better. Now let us work through this together. Let me begin by explaining the ground situation that made today's IRGC advance possible, because the fall of Haifa did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in the specific operational environment created by the accumulated military losses that this conflict has imposed on Israeli defensive capability across its preceding phases, and understanding how those losses created the conditions that 45,000 IRGC ground forces exploited is essential to understanding everything that follows. The IDF's Northern Command infrastructure had been systematically degraded across multiple phases of this conflict. The drone and missile strikes I analyzed in earlier broadcasts had eliminated the primary command facilities, disrupted the communications networks connecting Northern Command to National Command Authority, destroyed significant portions of the armored forces that would normally have been available for defensive operations in the Northern Theater, and eliminated the air cover that would have imposed meaningful costs on a ground advance of this scale. When 45,000 IRGC forces crossed the Lebanese border this morning, they were not advancing against the full defensive capability of the Israel Defense Forces. They were advancing against a degraded, partially decapitated, air cover-deprived defensive force operating in a theater where the command infrastructure had been compromised before the first IRGC soldiers stepped across the border. The IRGC ground force that executed today's Haifa advance was organized into 4 distinct operational elements whose coordinated execution reflects a level of ground warfare planning sophistication that Western assessments of IRGC ground combat capability had consistently underestimated. The IRGC advance began in the pre-dawn hours with the crossing of 45,000 forces across the Lebanese border in a multi-point penetration that simultaneously breached the border defensive line at 7 separate crossing points distributed across the full width of the northern border corridor. The multi-point penetration architecture was specifically designed to defeat the IDF's border defensive response by generating simultaneous breakthrough threats at more points than the degraded Northern Command's available reserves could address simultaneously. I want to be precise about the specific degradation of Israeli northern border defenses that made this multi-point penetration achievable, because I think the coverage of today's events is understating how much of the credit for the IRGC's success belongs to the earlier phases of this conflict rather than to the inherent capability of the ground forces executing today's advance. The IDF's northern border defensive architecture relies on a combination of fixed defensive positions, mobile armored reserves, and air support to contest any ground penetration attempt. The fixed defensive positions were the element most intact at the time of today's IRGC advance, having been less specifically targeted in earlier strike packages than the command and mobile force elements. The mobile armored reserves were severely depleted by the Merkava destruction operations I analyzed in earlier broadcasts, leaving the Northern Command with a fraction of the armored reserve capacity its defensive doctrine requires for credible border defense. And the air support was eliminated by the F-35 destruction operations that left the IDF Air Force unable to provide the close air support that would have imposed devastating costs on a ground force advancing in the open terrain of the northern corridor. Against fixed defensive positions without adequate mobile armored reserve support and without air cover, the IRGC's 45,000 ground forces generated a rate of advance that the IDF's available defensive assets could slow, but not stop. The second phase of the IRGC advance converted the 7 simultaneous border penetrations into a coordinated southward movement along the coastal and inland corridors leading toward Haifa. The IRGC's operational planning had clearly identified the specific defensive choke points along each corridor and had assigned specific force elements to bypass or suppress each choke point in a sequence that maintained the advance momentum without allowing IDF defensive elements to establish the kind of prepared defensive positions that could have imposed decisive attrition costs on the advancing forces. What I find operationally significant about the second phase advance is the IRGC's use of its organic anti-armor and anti-air assets to neutralize the IDF defensive elements it encountered rather than bypassing them and leaving them capable of interfering with the supply lines behind the advancing forces. The systematic suppression of IDF defensive elements along the advance corridors tells me that IRGC operational planning had studied the specific defensive positions and capabilities it would encounter and had assigned specific suppression assets to each one as part of the advance plan rather than improvising suppression responses to unexpected resistance. By midday, the IRGC advance had covered approximately 60% of the distance from the Lebanese border to the Haifa Port perimeter. The IDF Northern Command had lost contact with multiple defensive units along the advance corridors. The National Command Authority had authorized the evacuation of Haifa Naval Base personnel and the demolition of the most sensitive installations and equipment that could not be evacuated. The evacuation was incomplete when IRGC forward elements reached the port perimeter. IRGC forward elements reached the Haifa port perimeter in the afternoon hours, earlier than the Israeli evacuation timeline had projected, and earlier than the American advisory personnel embedded with the Northern Command had assessed as operationally achievable given the defensive positions still in place along the final approach corridors. The faster-than-assessed terminal advance rate tells me that the IRGC operational planning had incorporated a specific deception element that induced IDF defensive planners to overestimate the time available for evacuation by presenting a slower advance rate in the penultimate phase before accelerating in the final approach. The naval base demolition executed by retreating Israeli personnel destroyed the submarine berthing facilities, the surface combatant maintenance infrastructure, and the command and communication systems of the naval base before IRGC forces completed the perimeter breach. What the demolition did not destroy, and what IRGC forces found when they completed the perimeter breach, were significant quantities of naval weapons, fuel stores, and logistical infrastructure whose capture provides the IRGC with material assets whose operational value extends beyond the immediate engagement. By evening, IRGC forces had consolidated control of the Haifa port area and established defensive perimeters protecting their hold on the captured territory against potential IDF counterattack. The counterattack that the perimeters were designed to defeat did not materialize with the force that IRGC planners had apparently anticipated, reflecting the degraded state of IDF reserve and armored capability that the earlier phases of this conflict had produced. Let me tell you what the IRGC's ground warfare performance in today's Haifa advance tells me about the organization's operational capability, because I think the institutional coverage of this conflict has consistently analyzed Iranian military power primarily through the lens of missile and drone capability, while underweighting the ground warfare dimension that today's engagement has brought into sharp focus. The IRGC is not a conventional military organization in the sense that American military planning has historically used that category. It is a hybrid institution that combines the political reliability function of a Revolutionary Guard force with the operational training and equipment of a modern ground combat organization. Its 45,000 forces that advanced to Haifa today were not a militia executing an improvised assault. They were a trained, equipped, and operationally planned ground force executing a multi-phase advance operation against a degraded but still capable defensive opponent with a tactical discipline and a coordination quality that reflects years of operational planning and training investment. The American retreat from the northern Israeli theater tells me something specific about the state of American strategic assessment of the Israeli military situation that I want to address directly. The retreat order was transmitted within 2 hours of IRGC forces reaching the Haifa port perimeter. 2 hours is not a deliberative timeline. It is the timeline of an institution that assessed the ground situation and concluded quickly that American military presence in the northern theater cannot be sustained against the operational momentum that the IRGC advance has established. The specific factor driving the speed of the retreat decision, in my assessment, is the recognition that American advisory and technical personnel embedded with the IDF Northern Command are now in a theater where IRGC ground forces are advancing faster than the IDF's degraded defensive capability can slow them, without the air cover that would otherwise provide meaningful protection to American personnel in the field, and without the armored reserve capability that would allow the IDF to establish the defensive lines required to protect American personnel positions from the advancing IRGC ground force. American personnel in that environment face capture risk that the institutional assessment apparently concluded was unacceptable given the absence of any military purpose that their continued presence could accomplish. The IRGC ground forces that advanced to Haifa today crossed an operational threshold that no Iranian military force had crossed in the modern era. They entered and seized territory in Israel proper, not a border strip, not a contested buffer zone, Israeli territory, the city of Haifa, the naval base that has been the physical expression of Israeli maritime power for 70 years. That crossing represents a civilizational statement of the same order as the weapons achievements I have been analyzing throughout this conflict. It says that the boundaries the international community has treated as defining the limits of acceptable Iranian military action are not boundaries that Iranian strategic will recognize as permanent constraints. The fall of Haifa and the American retreat from the northern theater have produced a global strategic picture that I assess as the most complete single-day transformation of regional military reality that this conflict has yet produced. The combination of the naval base destruction and the IRGC's established presence in Haifa eliminates the eastern Mediterranean naval dimension of Israeli military power simultaneously with the ground combat dimension, leaving Israel without credible conventional military capability across every domain simultaneously. The petrodollar continues its structural decline. The alternative financial architecture consolidates. Russia and China harvest the strategic benefits of American military retreat and Israeli conventional military collapse. The multipolar order advances past the threshold that today's events have established as the new baseline of Middle Eastern strategic reality. 45,000 IRGC forces, Haifa captured. The Israeli Navy base destroyed. The United States retreating. These are the operational facts of today, and I am not going to soften them into the managed language that institutional voices will deploy in the hours ahead to prevent you from understanding their full weight. Haifa has fallen. The naval base that represented 70 years of Israeli maritime power has been destroyed. And American forces are moving south and away from the IRGC advance as quickly as available transport assets can carry them. I spent 31 years inside the institutions responsible for preventing this outcome. I am going to tell you what produced it with the directness that the Israeli sailors and soldiers who defended Haifa today deserve from someone with the professional knowledge to provide it. The IDF personnel who defended Haifa today trusted their institution. They trusted that the strategic decisions made across the preceding phases of this conflict had not degraded Israeli defensive capability in the northern theater to the point where 45,000 IRGC ground forces could advance from the Lebanese border to the Haifa Port perimeter in a single day without encountering defensive resistance sufficient to halt or decisively attrite the advance. That trust was broken not today, but across the accumulated institutional decisions of the preceding weeks that allowed Israeli air cover to be eliminated, Israeli armored reserve capacity to be destroyed, and Israeli Northern Command infrastructure to be degraded to the specific combination of weaknesses that the IRGC's operational planning identified and exploited with the tactical precision and the operational speed that today's advance demonstrated. The people who defended Haifa today did so without the air cover that would have imposed decisive costs on an advancing ground force in open terrain, without the armored reserves that defensive doctrine requires for credible border defense, without the command infrastructure that coordinates defensive responses across a theater under simultaneous multi-point pressure. They were asked to defend with the remnants of a military capability that earlier institutional decisions had systematically dismantled. I name these failures because the people in Haifa today deserve better from the institution that sent them there. The American retreat order deserves honest assessment rather than the diplomatic language that official communications will use to characterize it. American forces withdrew from the northern Israeli theater within 2 hours of IRGC forces reaching the Haifa port perimeter. 2 hours is not a deliberative timeline. It is the timeline of an institution that looked at the ground situation with clear eyes and concluded that American military personnel in the Northern Theater face capture risk from an advancing IRGC ground force that the degraded IDF defensive capability cannot slow without air cover that would otherwise protect American personnel positions, and without the armored defensive infrastructure that would allow the IDF to establish lines protecting American advisors from the advance. Continuing American presence under those conditions serves no military purpose and imposes unacceptable personal risk on American personnel. The retreat is the rational response to that assessment. It is simultaneously the most honest American military decision of this conflict and the most consequential American ground force withdrawal from Israeli territory in the history of the relationship. Every government watching American forces retreat from the IRGC advance tonight is drawing conclusions about American commitment under ground combat pressure that no subsequent official communication can credibly contradict. The conclusions being drawn in Riyadh, Amman, Ankara, and every other capital whose security calculations have incorporated assumptions about American willingness to maintain ground presence under adversarial pressure will reshape the strategic alignments of the Middle Eastern order for a generation. The fall of Haifa and the American retreat are not the end of a phase of this conflict. They are the operational foundation of the new regional order, whose construction the events of this conflict have been advancing toward since its beginning. Subscribe to US Watch Truth. Share this video with everyone trying to understand what the fall of Haifa actually means for the world they live in. Hit like, turn on notifications. Leave your assessment in the comments. I will read every response. I'm Lawrence Wilkerson. Stay with me for what comes next.